dark shadow is cast over the kingdom of Lordaeron, and a young prince stands on a dangerous precipice. So don't forget to like and subscribe and come, take a seat by the ruins. Arthas marched with grim determination upon the glorious city of Stratholme, a company of his loyal men, as well as the mage Jaina and his former mentor Uther the Lightbringer in tow. But once they arrived, it confirmed their worst fears. The food stores had already been plagued. Even now the citizenry had begun to turn one by one. It had been subtle so far. Arthas had for some time begun to be consumed by the notions of revenge. At first, it could seem as though he wished to only help his people, but as the darkness closed in all around him, his own struggle with the darkness within would begin to eat at him. For as they journeyed here, Medivh, in the guise of the prophet, had given Arthas the same warning he gave his father. Sail east, take your people with you. But just like this father, he would not heed it. He would kill this Mal'Ganis and save his people from their corruption. It was this same determination that caused him to give his next fateful order. Stratholme must be purged. Words that shook Jaina and Uther to their core. To kill those that had not yet turned. To kill those who may yet be saved. This was too much. The young mage could not watch Arthas do this, and she would be the first to take her leave. Uther would instead refuse the order, stating that he would not follow it, even if Arthas were his king. Arthas stayed cold and calm, almost as though he expected this outcome. He accused the Lightbringer of treason, and in full view and earshot of his men, relieved him of command. Arthas was resolute. He would take his men and take the first fateful steps into the city proper. While at first it seemed relatively peaceful, chaos would quickly begin to descend upon the streets. The first citizens began to succumb to the plague, and as quickly as their frail forms would perish, they would rise again, mindless and feral zombies. It was here that Mal'Ganis first revealed himself. He collected the undead and guided them deep into the city, but not before taunting the young prince to come and find him. It was pure madness. Some citizens would succumb, others would attempt to flee, only to be cut down by Arthas and his company, or any that did make it past them would be taken by the Scourge. Others instead would opt to end their own misery, throwing themselves to the flames. It was only when the city was all but destroyed, a smoking ruin, that Arthas and Mal'Ganis would at last meet face to face. But this first interaction would be brief. Mal'Ganis cackled amidst the smoking ruins. He bid Arthas to come to Northrend if he truly wished to confront him, and then teleported away. The young prince would faithfully swear to hunt him to the ends of the earth. As Jaina and Uther returned to further assess what had happened, they could scarcely believe the atrocities Arthas had committed. But the prophet appeared to Jaina now, and gave her the dangerous warning, that if Arthas were to venture to Northrend, he would surely die. That their only hope was for her to sail west to Kalimdor with as many of her people as she could. Jaina would trust the prophet, and do as he bade. If only Arthas would have done the same. Instead, he abandoned reason, and over the next few months planned an expedition to the continent of Northrend, promising his people he would end the undead plague once and for all. With a large detachment of his men, he would eventually reach the icy shores of Daggercap Bay. A stroke of good luck at last. An old friend and mentor to Arthas, the dwarf Muradin Bronzebeard, was here conducting an expedition of his own. The Explorers League were investigating a rumoured Runeblade artifact that was said to be in the vicinity. After joining forces, they crushed a nearby undead camp, but found no signs of the Dreadlord Mal'Ganis. It was then that an emissary arrived by Zeppelin to inform Arthas to return home by order of Terenas and Uther. But Arthas was so consumed by the bitterness now that he had no intention of leaving. With the help of mercenaries, he managed to reach the ships before his soldiers and would burn them to ash, preventing any means of return. In another act of depravity, he told his men that it was the mercenaries that had burned them, and after his men had turned on them and killed, he proclaimed that only hope of returning home now was to defeat Mal'Ganis and claim victory. Muradin was disgusted at what he witnessed, but chose not to act. Deeper they trudged into the icy wilderness, searching not only for Mal'Ganis, but this Runeblade also. Arthas believed he could use it as a weapon in his fight against the Dreadlord. After much searching, however, they at last found the blade deep in a shadowed cavern. But the wise dwarf read the inscription on the blade, that it was a curse to all those who would wield it. "Turn back, save your men, and return to your people," Muradin exclaimed, but his words fell on deaf ears. He was totally lost. Arthas called out to the dark spirits of the cavern to relinquish the sword to him so he may defeat his enemies, that he was willing to pay whatever price they had in mind. As he laid his fingers upon the hilt, a cold, icy shiver coursed through his body, as a presence called to him now, a darker voice of ill intent. Muradin had been rendered unconscious by one of the rogue shards of ice that had splintered from the sword's frozen sheath upon its removal, and was summarily left for dead. Along with the discarded hammer, Light's vengeance, the prince would no longer have need for either. With this weapon, he was now a force of nature, and he used it to crush the Dreadlord's army and confront the Demon Lord. Another cackle, as Mal'Ganis thought himself the victor after all. He told Arthas of the voice, that it was the Lich King, the Lord of the Dead, and through a sinister grin he asked what the voice told him to do now. Much to his surprise, it told him to utterly destroy the Dreadlord, which Arthas did without hesitation. Unbeknownst to Arthas, the Dreadlord had survived the encounter, just barely. For some time, Arthas was lost to the icy madness of the wastes. He became the very first of Ner'zhul's new Death Knights, clad in Saronite armour. He would eventually return to his men, only to cut them down where they stood and raise them into undeath to serve him. The runeblade he wielded, named Frostmourne, had the power to take souls, and Arthas, when he first grasped it, became its first victim. Still, he would gather up his loyal soldiers and travel south, to the now ravaged lands of Lordaeron. As the ships sailed south across the treacherous straits, the dead that were terrorizing the human kingdoms were called to pull back. This sudden receding of the corrupted horrors led many to believe it was over. Arthas had saved them after all. Many cried for relief. When Arthas arrived on the shores, he was celebrated as a saviour, a hero. He was doused in rose petals as his beloved kingdom welcomed him back with open arms. The prodigal son had returned, and with him, salvation. That is, until without hesitation, Arthas plunged his sword into his father's chest, King Terenas Menethel's heart, leaving his crown to crash on the stone floor covered in blood. Soon after, the dead would pour into the city in greater numbers than ever before. The kingdom had fallen, betrayed by the one who swore to protect them. Jaina was gathering as many people as she could to sail away on the Kulturan fleet, as many of the Paladin Order of the Silver Hand stayed behind to protect their escape. This time, and all of its evils would haunt the survivors for the rest of their days. While many of the races offered what aid they could in these dark days, the gnomes were suffering their own preoccupation. As their city of marvels, Gnomeregan, grew in size, so did their technological prowess. It was the whirring and humming of these machines that ultimately created its downfall. The dwarves and gnomes that had first awakened in Uldaman had long since turned to flesh from metal and stone. But they were not the only Titan creations to slumber within. There was one race, considered a failure by the Keepers due to their unpredictable and brutish nature, the Trogs. The ever-inquisitive dwarves had begun to excavate the Titan facility of Uldaman, and had inadvertently awoken them. After the initial slaughter, the survivors would flee back to Ironforge. These Trogs were not done yet, and pursued them by tunneling deep underground. That was until the noises produced by the Gnomeregan machines proved too enticing, and they were drawn to the city instead. This was a gnome problem now, and with their allies besieged by the dead in the lands above, Gul'dan Mekatork, one of the respected leaders, declared that they shall fight this Trog threat alone. A long and brutal war fought out of sight of most, but nothing could compare to what happens next. But that will have to wait for next episode. And thank you to everyone for all the likes and subscribes. It's amazing to see how we're always growing this community. Oh, and don't forget to come back anytime.